my lovelies, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking you through the books that I read in June. I have been sorely putting off making this video because this June was the most books I've ever read in a month. I read 11, which is going to take quite a while to get through, so I'm going to try and be as concise and quick about this as possible, but I've really been putting off trying to make this video. It's the 14 books in 14 days challenge that really ramped up my reading this month, and since then I've been in a bit of a slump and I've only read one book in the first 2 weeks of July. So without further ado, here are the 11 books that I read in June. The first book I finished in June was Always and Forever, Lara Jean by Jenny Han, which is the third and final book in the Towards the Boys I Loved Before trilogy. Now, this book didn't have as much plot as the other two books in the series. I have to say that the ending of all three seemed to be a little bit circular. They seem to come to the same sort of endings, but I do feel like I did need to know where the relationship was going to be going into things like college. So I feel like I did need to read something about it, but it wasn't as plot driven as the other two were. And I think because the first book has such a unique plot that it's very hard to keep up that standard. It just made this plot feel a little bit more of a mundane contemporary compared to book one. I also was hoping that John would come back into this more and that to be more of a choice conflict, which they were sort of hinting at in book two. And because it didn't, I now wish that book two had more of the choice conflict between John and Peter. But the thing that saved me from bumping this down from 3.5 stars is the Stormy plotline, which was really nice and really emotional, and also the yearbook letter at the end. That was very, very cute. So that kept me in my little like cliche romance sort of binge, but it was very like a very ordinary contemporary compared to book one. And also the blurb kind of spoils what's going to be the big like plot points in this, but I still teared up at it. So I've given this 4 stars. Now, the next book I finished in June was A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Brigid, Kemmerer, and oh my god, I love this book so much. I bought it on a recommendation of a flatmate who told me that if I loved A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is here, I would love this, and as a Beauty and the Beast retelling, I think I prefer this. It was just so good, and it kept to more of like the original plot points of the Beauty and the Beast source material if you're going off like the Disney film. So I really love this, and I also love the fact that it's not a straight up like love curse story. It's not very straightforward. You still have ambiguity at the end leading up to book 2, which is going to be in January, and I don't think I can wait that long because it was just so good. I really, really love this book. As well as being a completely new and unique take on the Beauty and the Beast story, it was also had so much more depth than I was expecting. We had characters that struggled with cancer, we had a gay relationship being explored in it, and I love Noah. I really want to see more of Noah in the next book. And also the protagonist has cerebral palsy, which is something I was not expecting and I have never seen represented before. So that is just, the depth of this book blew me away. I was not expecting it to be this well rounded and this well thought out, so I just love it. This book mixes up the setting of Washington DC and mixes it with a fantasy world that's its own type of world, and I'm usually very, very wary of mixing fantasy with real life. I sometimes think having real life in it can take away from the escapism of fantasy, but this blended it really well. It didn't have too much of the real world in it. It did it very seamlessly, and I thought it was just so well done that it took away that wariness that I had, because I really don't like real world things in magic because it just creates a barrier in my head, but this did it so well. It was so well paced as well until all hell broke loose at the end, and the ending destroyed me. And there's little nuggets like Sarah J. Maas does, so I see why it's been compared to A Court of Thorns and Roses, where you can see that the world is starting to expand and she's setting in those like little hints ready to expand this world even more. And I can't wait for book 2, which comes out in January. So I think it's called A Heart So Fierce and something, but 5 stars. Utterly loved it. The next book I read, which is the first I read for the 14 books in 14 days challenge, is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. And this book was a little bit of a disappointment to me. It's meant to be a retelling of the background of Troy, but through the women's perspective. So I appreciate so much what it is trying to do, and it did in the first section show like the brutal realities, and did show things that, although it's harsh and it's horrible to read, it's what would have more likely to happen, and this is what women have had to have gone through history, even though it's based around more of the Greek mythology type side of things. But it started to get more and more perspectives from Achilles, who is the male lead in every other retelling, every other telling of the Battle of Troy. So I think by having Achilles' perspective, it took away from what it was trying to do by showing the women's perspectives. I get that it was showing Achilles in a new light, in a not very flattering light, showing the darker side and more horrible side to men in war. But I think if the author doesn't think that she could have a full novel without putting Achilles in, if she feels like she has to put Achilles in to create a full book, then that just takes away from the message of the book to be the women's stories. But I do think it's still worth a read. I was just really annoyed with the Achilles perspectives part, and I thought they were very dry, and I just wanted to get back to the women. So overall, I've given this book a 3.5 stars because it's a tiny bit disappointing, but the first part did really do what I was expecting it to do, and then it sort of trailed off towards the end. I think the book would have had way more impact if it just stuck solely to its original premise of being women. And I have to say that this is going to have a trigger warning in it for sexual assault and abuse and all that jazz, so be wary going into this because it is very harsh and very brutal at the beginning, which it needed to do. And I just wish it had stuck to it all the way through and stuck to its guns. The next book I read is The Haunting on Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Now this is a book that sort of did its job of bewildering and chilling me. It was at first a little bit jarring, the amount of commas and long sentences used in it, but it clicked into place and I found a flow that it had nice psychological like build up to it. But I did not realise until after I finished this book, probably because I have the Netflix cover away from my blind date for a book, that this was written in 1959. And the fact that I thought this was all happening in the modern day is a testament to its good writing. There's nothing in this book that ages it or dates it in any way, which is a very hard thing to do with novels that you're going to be setting in the real world. So I found that very impressive, and I think that I need to go back and reread this book with that in mind, because I was in a bit of a bewilderment, especially with the ending. I get that maybe in 1959 that this ending would have been a complete shock horror and something new, but after 60 years of horror stories I've had access to, that things have become a lot more extreme in the genre of horror since then. I think I was just expecting a little bit more from it, but I definitely want to give this a reread. So at the moment I put this at 3.5 to 4 stars, and I just think I need to go back to it because I really did like the flow of it when I got into it, but I need to keep in mind its context, I think, when reading this again. But I can see why this is labelled one of the most classic horror stories, and I definitely want to check out more Shirley Jackson's. The next book is actually a collection of short stories, or again horror stories, because I was in that mood for a good classic horror, and The Haunting on Hill House and The Stories in Nice definitely hit the spot for classic horror. And this is Romance is Dead by C.L. Raven, which is signed edition from Comic Con, thank you very much, and it is a collection of anti-romance stories. For a book about twisted anti-romance tales, I loved it. I honestly thought they were all so good. I especially loved that you had reoccurring and stories that circle back to Trey and Sol, and the bonus story at the end about Trey's background and how before his first mannequin was just such a sweet touch, and I really loved it. I will never get over Aphrodite being an agony aunt columnist, and that was such a brilliant take on things because that was so unique, and I've never seen that sort of like take on Greek myth before in such a really nice like twisted way as well. So I thought that was great. There were the odd ones that are a little bit generic, but sometimes you just want that generic horror story, and it really just hit the spot. So I've given this 4.5 stars. The next book I picked up is My Name is Victoria by one of my absolute favourite people, which is Lucy Worsley, who is the curator at Kensington and a very trusted historian. Therefore I know that the events, places and names in this book are all accurate, but I also loved how this book weaves in a lot of fiction into the story to make it something more. The brilliance of this weaving of fiction into it is made very clear in the absolute must-read epilogue, which is the reason that I bumped this right up to 5 stars. I was honestly kind of looking for something to push it down, with it being like a middle grade sort of children's book, but not too young of a children's book. So I was looking for things to not 5-star it just for it being like, this isn't a young adult book, and young adult books are the best things in the world. But I really honestly could not find anything to knock it down to 5 stars. Maybe the absurd ending of it, but if you read the epilogue, you'll understand why it's absurd, and I absolutely love why she's done it. I love that Lucy Worsley is playing with the fact that we will never know what life was like under the Kensington system for Victoria, and she's also using the unreliability of young Victoria's very melodramatic diaries to her own advantage to create a fully enjoyable piece of historical fiction. Like I said, the ending was absurd, but really, really fun to think about, and it just serves as a reminder that even though we have so much about historical people, that we still can never know, that everything we see about people from the past is all just a perspective on them. We can't ever know them for sure, even with their own diaries being accessible, because we don't know how much Victoria lied in her diaries, and that is used as a really cool plot point in this. I love the way her diaries are used. So it's just a reminder that the representations we see of historical people are never actually going to be them, even though you can try and make them as close to the truth as possible. So I just love the cuteness of this as a story, and I loved the sort of underlying historical message about history being stories. I don't actually have this book because I read it from the library as like a smaller novel to fit into the 14 book challenge, and that is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, I don't really have much to say about this book. It was a little bit of a disappointment, really. I think the characters sort of had no depth to them. I didn't understand the motives that were going on beyond the characters, and I just think the whole setup into the plot was just weak. Once you got into the storyline, it was reasonably decent. It's just that little niggle of getting into the storyline, like Gatsby waiting 5 years living across the road. How realistic is that, really? It just seemed like a big jump before you got into the plot that was going on. I wasn't really engaged with the writing style at any point, and I didn't feel attached to any of the characters, which is a big thing for me. I need to be able to relate or feel or empathize with the characters, or even hate them, but these characters didn't spark any type of emotion in me. There's also some like racist undertones in it, which is kind of comes with the era of it being written in the 20s, but I have actually read much worse than it, so I've just given this book a 3-star. It was just a little bit disappointing, but not overly bad. The next book I read is Burnt Shadows by Kamila Shamsie. This is one of my dissertation reads, which is why I was kind of a little bit disappointed when this did not follow Hiroko and her surviving of the atomic bomb in Nagasaki, like the blurb implied. It actually deals with a lot of heavy stuff because it starts off in Nagasaki, moves to the partition of India, then has people involved in the CIA and the war in the Middle East, and finally moves on to New York in post 9/11. So it deals with a lot of heavy stuff, and I found it a little bit dense to get through at times. It's hard to explain, but it's one of those adult books that reads like an adult book. Like, it's so dense to get through, and you're reading several pages and we're feeling like nothing is actually happening, and you're just reading and reading and nothing's happening in it. I have read other adult books, I've read plenty in my time, and people like Stephen King, who is there on my shelves, just has a great flow, but this just feels so dense. Like, it's purposely adult, which is isolating in some points. So it's a hard thing to explain, but it just got to me that I felt like I was reading and not getting anywhere with the book at some points. And I think that's also because I was not interested in the genre that comes with like things like the CIA, and I was disappointed by the fact that the blurb was indicating that this is going to have a lot about Nagasaki in it, and it doesn't really. It has a very small section at the beginning and then has scattered references throughout it, but it is still going to be so useful. And I did really like the Nagasaki and Delhi section, so the first half of the book, maybe the first third even of the book. So I'm going to give this 3 stars. Then I read something that really did focus on the atomic bombs, and that is Barefoot, a cartoon story of Hiroshima by, I'm going to say this one, Keiji Nakazawa. Now, this book was, this is a manga, so it's done all through like cartoon. So to actually visualize, to actually see what's going on with the bomb is so harrowing. It has a really strange mix of humor with brute honesty that I think only the Japanese can actually do, which I'm noticing in a couple of other books that I'm reading about from a Japanese perspective. And it's just, one minute he'll have this big jokey section and the next minute people's faces will be melting off, but it's true stuff that happened, and to see it visually is just a complete different perspective on it. That is so powerful and distressing when you think the author went through this when he was 6. So I definitely recommend this as a read. It's quite hard to get hold of, but it's such a powerful read that I've given it 5 stars, because it really, really does not shy away from showing you what actually happened to the people who survived or died in Hiroshima. It has things like faces melting off. It has things like classroom suicide pacts before the war, because it was very hard to live in Japan during the war. It was very walking on eggshells sort of environment to be in Japan during wartime, and this book shows this because it has quite a bit before the actual bomb drops and the bomb drops in volume 1, and it has the immediate aftermath. After such a traumatizing read, I decided to pick up something a bit more lighthearted, and I picked up Pook by Rudyard Kipling. This is a book about Dan and Una, who were playing in their garden one day and accidentally summoned the ancient fairy Pook, who has the gift of storytelling, and takes them through Britain's history. It's a very, very beautiful book with maps, and you've also got poetry separating all the sections out, and then you've also got the prose story, and there's brilliant illustrations. So it's a really, really nice read, a very British read. It's very nationalistic at times with which history it chooses to represent, but it's also a really nice kids read. I really like this because the writing style about it just felt very familiar, even though this is a 100-year-old book that I've never heard of and never picked up before. It felt so nostalgic in the way it was telling the stories, and I think that's from the story writing style of books that I've read when I was younger, maybe even Lemony Snicket, because it goes through explaining things as well as having the story. It's just a wonderfully sweet story about childhood curiosity that mixes fairy tales with history. It's a little bit repetitive in its structure in some ways, the way that Una and Dan always have their memory blanked and then they come back to it. It's a bit repetitive in that sense, but I also really love the poetry that divides it. Is just such a nice element to it, and it's a really cute way of getting poetry into a story without it feeling forced. It feels natural to have these poetry sections in between, and I really like them because the poetry style changes for each poem as well, and they relate back to the history that's been told in that chapter. It is very nationalistic history. It's history designed to make Britain look good, so there's some underlying prejudice in it, but it was a sweet way to get children into history, I think, and I can also see why this is put in my medievalism module. The ending was very, very abrupt. It's almost like it's like they've had the full story, because there is a sequel to this which is Rewards and Fairies. I'm holding this upside down. There is a sequel to this which is Rewards and Fairies, which I've been trying to find. I think I'm going to buy it to read it because I definitely want to read it. But I wouldn't say that it's going to have a sequel feel, because it feels like this was one big story and it's just been like cut in half. It doesn't feel like a follow-up story. It's just going to be continuing the telling of history to Dan and Una, I think. So it just felt very abrupt way of ending it. But overall, I thought it was a really nice read and I enjoyed it, so I've given it 4 stars. And the last book I read in June is another manga, and that is the first volume of Assassination Classroom Lara. This is a story which is completely bonkers to explain, because it's about an alien life form who is so powerful that he could destroy Earth at any minute, but he wants to teach, so he's become this classroom teacher, and the deal is that these students need to be able to assassinate him to stop him from destroying the world. So he's made like a deal with them to teach them for so long, and if they don't assassinate him in that time, he's going to destroy the world. But he's also actually such a good teacher to the students, so it's bonkers, and the humor in it is so on point, but there's also really like scary moments, because the manga style in it, I really like the manga drawing style in it, and it does such a good job of when they want him to be scary. The art style shows it really well. So even though Koro Sensei, which is the name they've given to this monster who wants to destroy the world, who is stupidly overpowered. I don't want him to die at the end of this series anymore, because he is such a good teacher to the children, and he's such an amazing character. Yet he's a monster, although I suspect from the hints that we've been given about his background in Volume 1 that he's not going to turn out to be a monster. So it's the way it's done, it's not, if you could call this straightforward anyway, it's not going to be a straightforward story. There are really good hints ready for a background that is going to expand out, and also the ending had a really good cliffhanger for this to get deeper. So I really love this book, and I really wish that I hadn't read it now, because I read it from the York Explorer library, and now I'm back in Wales, so I don't have access to the other like dozen volumes of this manga, and there is a anime adaptation of it which I think would work so well for this storyline as well, but I don't want to watch it before I finish reading it, so now I can't get the rest of the book. So it's wholesome in a really weird way, and also creepy at times. So this really weird juxtaposition, again, it's this Japanese writer's style of mixing like humor with horror. I loved it, so I've given it 4.5 stars. It's that little half a star has just dropped down because there are some repetitive phrasings in it, and I don't know whether that's the translation that's made it that way, but oh god, it's so good. And the clever use of the art style as well, like having the paneling of the art being black to show that this is something that's happened in the past, that it's a flashback. Oh, it's just, I love this, and it's made me really realise how good manga is, because I have read small pieces of manga before. I have read All You Need Is Kill, which is a manga I got given on Valentine's Day, actually once, but that's the only time I've really read manga apart from Barefoot, but that was dissertation reading, so it didn't have the same feel to it, and it's also based on truth, so it's a different type of feel. So this has made me realise that I want to get into manga. So those are the 11 books that I have read in June. So thank you so much for watching. Like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.